Hi everybody, welcome to MAC366 week 4 and the film that we have for you this week is the 1977 occult classic by Dario Argento, Suspiria. In case you haven't seen this film, you're in for a treat. This is a film that gets name checked regularly by the great and the good in the kind of context of film horror. This is a film that is loosely based upon Thomas de Quincey's poetic prose from the 1840s. I think it was called Suspiria dis Profundis, which was an exploration of the processes of memory whilst under the influence of hallucinogens. And that's quite fitting, really, because what you're about to see is a film that has a very hallucinogenic element or quality to it. It is a film that seems to speak about the descent into madness and the fragmentation of sanity. This is something that is echoed constantly throughout every single frame of this film. And you'll find it very difficult to miss when you kind of watch it, because Dario Argento employs a very, very expressive use of Technicolor throughout this story, which is essentially a story of an American ballet student called Susie, played by Jessica Harper, who transfers to a German-based dance academy, which hides a hideous secret. Now, the school is a front for a coven of powerful witches, and I'll not say too much more about what happens in the narrative, because I think part of the pleasure with this film is the surprises with which you kind of encounter in it. Now, this is, as I said, a cult film, but it's also an occult film, sticking with the kind of themes developed in week 3, where we looked at The Exorcist. This is a film that has often been compared and contrasted to The Exorcist. This is from Italy, though. It's an Italian horror film. Like I say, it's highly influential. It was a very popular film. Perhaps nowhere near as popular as The Exorcist. I think Fox, the studio who released it, I think they cited it as something like, it was in their top 10 most popular films of the year in 1977. I think it grossed quite a small revenue amount, really, only about just under 2 million at the box office, which is just short of 8 million these days, adjusted for inflation. But it was a big success in and across Europe as well. You'll not be able to get away from the fact that it has this very vivid kind of colour palette. Red acts as a kind of very significant colour throughout the film. You'll hardly escape it. Argento was kind of committed to using this really vibrant colour palette, and he employs this thing called the 3-strip colour process, which was used, I think, originally in The Wizard of Oz back in 1939, and I think there's a reason for that. If you think about kind of what the plot of The Wizard of Oz is about. And the technique was quite dated even by the time Argento was making it, and I think this might be one of the last films to ever be made using this 3-strip process, which essentially had 3 strips of film in the film reel being recorded at the same time. So you had not just a black and white negative, but you also had multi-layered negatives that could create and overlay lots of different kind of colour palettes against one another. And it creates this really vivid, almost garish kind of like aesthetic. I think Argento was cited as saying that he was really after trying to capture some of the kind of colour tones of earlier Disney films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which if we think about that film, features a prominent witch as well. It is a story of a virginal young heroine surrounded by evil, and she has to kind of make her way through that world. It's also heavily influenced by the kind of 1920s German expressionist movement. There are tropes that you can see if you're familiar with films like the 1929 film Das Cabinet de Dr. Caligari. You can see the use of kind of obscure camera angles, close-ups, off-kilter shots, weird, surreal like backgrounds and foregrounds kind of merging and mashing into one another. And in the context of German expressionism, this was often used to kind of foreground or highlight some of the kind of, the unreal nature of the horrific experiences that many people were going through in terms of their films. The The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is about a somnambulist, someone who's experiencing kind of strange dreams and nightmares, and is unable to distinguish between reality and fiction. And the environment was used with the camera placement in a way to kind of echo that uncertainty and that anxiety. And I think you see elements of that in this film as well, so it's worth watching out for. Just the usual spiel for my introductions. I normally kind of show you just how well the film's been received. It has a fairly consistent score everywhere you go. Metacritic has a 79 from the critics and a 7.9 from users. Suspiria over on Rotten Tomatoes has a fresh rating, 93% hot. Audience give it a little slightly lower score, 83%. So there's still something that speaks to people today in this. The blood pours freely in Argento's classic. A gallo horror as grandiose and glossy as it is gory. I've given it a 3 out of 5 over on Letterboxd, but I'm in the minority here. I think some of Argento's later work, particularly kind of films like Tenebra, are actually more interesting than Suspiria. But I'm probably being a bit of a pedant here, because out of the 3,500 people who have voted for it, it does have a kind of fairly weighted 4 score. And over on IMDb, we see it has a score of 7.4 out of 10 from 80,000 votes. So this is a film that deserves your attention. It's worth looking at. It's definitely interesting. It's a film which was subject to severe cuts in order to be released in theatres. I think the American release saw about 8 minutes worth of cuts in order for it to qualify for the R rating, whereas the BBFC in the UK, I think, subjected to about 1 minute's worth of cuts. But it's an interesting film nonetheless. Mark Kermode, the film critic, introduced this film as part of the BFI special a couple of years ago, and he said nothing can compare to the savage beauty of Argento's head-spinning original Suspiria. And I guess that's relevant because in 2018 or 2017 there was an indie darling remake of Suspiria, which is also worth watching if you can get a hold of it. Adam Smith, writing in Empire, said it's an appetizer to the thoroughly bizarre world of Italian horror. Suspiria is the perfect antipasto. And Alan Jones, writing in Radio Times, says it's a stunning combination of menacing Grand Guignol atmosphere, dazzling colours, gory violence, lush decor, and a pounding soundtrack. The soundtrack is provided by the prog rock band Goblin, who are not exactly subtle in this film. I think it starts off with the first track that you actually hear, just starts shouting "witch, witch, witch." So there's no hiding what this film is about, really. John K. Muir, an academic writing in 2007, said each and every frame of Suspiria is composed with an artistic, remarkable attention to colour. So these are the kind of things that you might be wanting to watch out for, pay attention to. Naturally, we have some questions to consider, and these are just questions for us to consider in the webinar later on this week. But this is part of a double header this week. Remember, we've already looked at The Exorcist. We've already looked at some elements of The Abject and Barbara Creed's work on the monstrous feminine. This film and its focus, particularly on witches, falls into that paradigm somewhat. So bear in mind that women are the centre point of this narrative. Some of the questions that I've set here are skewed around those ideas. So Gerard Len, writing in 1979, has argued that the figure of the witch is incontestably monstrous, and that it is the only active role for women in horror, and that the great monsters are all male. Quite a claim. I think this tells us quite a bit. He also says that there are no noteworthy female psychopaths or mad scientists. This is something like I think Barbara Creed counters in her work, actually, in her chapter from The Monstrous Feminine on Carrie, who she describes as a witch-like character. Anyway, so just taking what Len says there, bear in mind this is a film all about women. How does horror depict women historically, and where does Suspiria fit into that? What kind of historic evolution of women? What kind of historic evolution have we seen with regards to the depiction of women within horror texts? And thinking about this applied to kind of the notion of witches as well on screen more generally. Now, Len's claim that women and witches are incontestably monstrous is one that seems, as Creed puts it, to be imbued with an element of sexist, and patriarchal kind of one-sidedness. Does this claim that he makes hold up today? Did it ever? That's up to you to unpick and decide. Now, Creed also sees witches as being essentially sexual in nature. She speaks about the witch's curse, which obviously pertains to kind of menstruation and women on the cusp of childhood and adulthood. Something that we discussed a little bit last week, but something we can discuss in more detail this week. She says that witches essentially are also seen as kind of phallic women who have phallic power, or power often associated with patriarchal power. And what this often does is this kind of depiction of women this depiction of witches as powerful women in a kind of negative light robs them of their kind of potentially positive powers, because the ancient history of witches is that they were healing women, that they were essentially medicine and herbalists, experts in medicine and herbalists. So does Suspiria treat witches in a way that conforms to this idea of witches as a negative, or does it offer any kind of positives? What can we say? What can we say about Creed's ideas in relation to other witch films you might have seen, like say The Witch by Robert Eggers, or any other contemporary example, like even the remake? You might want to think about comparing and contrasting the kind of two main female protagonists in this film. We have Susie, played by Jessica Bennett. Is it Jessica Bennett? God, I want to say it's Jessica Bennett. Jessica Harper. Apologies. Jessica Bennett, who's that? Compare and contrast the figures of Susie and the Witch Queen, Mater Suspiriorum. Is it fair to say that Mater Suspiriorum is associated with notions of abjection and disgust and repulsion? What are we to make of Susie then? If Mater Suspiriorum is the abject mother, the phallic woman, how does Susie compare and contrast in this respect? What kind of character traits do we see in her? Is she a knowledgeable woman? Does she use her kind of female knowledge, her female power? Is there an innate female power coming from her, or is she a bit like Snow White, almost like pure? And if she is depicted as a woman, like a chaste woman, pure and innocent, what is Argento trying to say in terms of how do these two relate to each other? Think about this in terms of moralistic and kind of virtuous kind of ideas. Robin Woods argued that monster films are often related to sexual and emotional repressions. Could such a reading be true for this film? Does this film speak to you about sexual or emotional repression? Last question then to think about is that the role of the witch as a hag, as an aged and decrepit or postmenopausal woman, speaks to the anxieties over the role of powerful women more generally, whose strength lies in traits that seem counter to kind of what patriarchy values in women. Do you agree or disagree with this idea? Can you identify any positive or empowering contemporary depictions of female power that seem witch-like, while not conforming to kind of patriarchal values about women's roles and what women should be? Interesting discussion points, I think. We can talk more about the film specifically when we meet on Friday. But I hope you enjoyed. I'll post a link to it soon. I should also add, I'll be adding a list of related films that you can check out if you're interested in films around witchcraft. And I'll try and source as many of them as possible from Box of Broadcasts for your delectation.